I went looking on the internet, and of course, I started with Craigslist, which is the source of all truth. And they don't really have much in the way of chef cookbook authoring, even in the job listings. But I did find an actual cookbook authoring post. And it wasn't really for the technical stuff, but they did have some key things here. Writing recipes is very different to writing a book, or a cookbook in this case. And you'll probably already know that that theme is pretty relevant. But anyways, Craigslist notwithstanding, clearly we need something that's a little bit more of a geeky cookbook. This is also probably not relevant. I went ahead and actually searched on real job boards where you might find actual tech stuff, and still there wasn't a whole lot out there in terms of jobs involving writing cookbooks. The sponsored ads here got close, but even then, you're still seeing things like a senior marketing manager for cookbooks at publishing houses. Interestingly, I didn't save it, but if you go below the fold here, there was a job posting for chef. I guess they're hiring. We are too, by the way. But anyways, jobs notwithstanding, there's definitely a job out there for working with existing cookbooks within your company. I'm going to talk about 3 different techniques for working with it. The first one is forking. I'll cover why you should and shouldn't do that. The second one is wrapper cookbooks, and the third is monkey patching. Some of these things that I'm going to be showing are not necessarily best practice. Please learn from my mistakes from the early days. And in fact, to start, I'm going to share my very first cookbook. Let's go back to 2009, state of the art. I wrote a message of the day cookbook. The way that this was shared among the community and sort of standard practice at the time was write a blog post and post it, and then other people would basically just copy and tweak to suit. There was really no centralized community, and in true fashion, I took someone else's example that has been lost to the sands of time, wrote a Mott D cookbook, used Figlet to give myself some lovely ASCII art, and now my servers were chef managed because clearly the message of the day is all that you actually need to configure on a server. But alas, this was in February of 2009, and by June of 2009, the company I worked for had pivoted and changed names, so I had to find a new font and rerun Figlet and change it. But this made me think a little bit that not necessarily all cookbooks need to actually be a community cookbook. Sometimes they're just going to be so different from organization to organization that does it really make sense. At Socrata, we have a large number of government customers, and they're still trying to understand the concept of us being a multi-tenant software as a service platform where we're not just running servers for them. So they have security standards where they want the login screen or the message of the day on a server to look something like this. If you actually go to the community cookbook site and you look to see is there a message of the day cookbook? In fact, there are 2. One of them is Mott Detail. It's probably the cleaner one of the 2. It lets you append things to the standard canonical Ubuntu cookbook. But the actual message of the day one, the one that you would probably pull up first if you were just to search, this is actually the message of the day that it puts up. It's a little funny. All right, so anyways, how are we going to actually work with these types of cookbooks? And I'm going to start with forking, which is actually not really the best technique for a lot of cases, but for something like the message of the day, it's probably honestly the best option. It's going to favor stability over new functionality. It will be harder to contribute any of these changes back to the community, but it is the simplest thing that could possibly work. So let's look at a Mott D cookbook. We have an attributes file. I'm not actually sure what attributes there are in this case, but there might be some. There's a default.rb recipe that is going to largely just place the template in there, and then you see I have a mottd.erb. So I might take the Mott D cookbook from some community site. It's going to have an ERB file that says you are on a production server, moo. And I'm just going to go ahead and replace it with something that I need to do here. That's forking in essence. There's really not a whole lot to it, but I did want to touch on one other pattern in practice, which has already kind of fallen by the wayside. However, if you're still doing it, I want to encourage you to not do it anymore. Show of hands, does anyone recognize this commit? Anyone? A few old timers. So back in 2009, actually, before I even got started, this was the first attempt at how to do community cookbooks. If you look at the commits there, there's two directories that are created, a cookbooks directory and a site cookbooks directory. So the idea here is that you would actually have both, and you would put your community cookbooks in the cookbooks directory, and then you would put your overrides in the site cookbooks directory. And that way you could sort of keep your community cookbooks clean and pristine. This is not technically forking, but morally it really is exactly that. You're just making changes, but now you have two places that you need to look for everything. So if you are an old timer and you are still doing this, please stop. There are better practices out there. All right. The next technique is wrapper cookbooks. And this is the first one that I think is going to be a really common practice that you'll see a lot of people advocating for in the community now. So as an example, I'm going to use the rsyslog cookbook, which probably a number of you might already be using. There's a couple recipes. There's a client recipe. There's a server recipe and a default one that typically probably just includes the client. We might have some attributes, some template files that aren't really relevant for this. We actually use the community rsyslog cookbook, but there's a couple things that we want to customize on it. First off, if you actually look at the cookbook documentation, there's an attribute that you can set as to whether or not you want to be using the TCP or the UDP protocol for your syslog server, which one you're going to be listening on. It turns out that our syslog can actually listen to both. And in our particular case, we have some services that need to be using TCP and some that need to be using UDP. And I didn't want to stand up a second server just to have that happen. So I want the ability to actually listen on both UDP and TCP. This is something that honestly is probably better contributed back to the community, but for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to override it and use a wrapper cookbook. The second technique is that just as sort of internal policy to our company, we want to gzip old archived logs. Maybe that's not necessarily relevant to the rsyslog cookbook itself, but for our particular case, we're going to want to do that. So I wrote a Socrata rsyslog cookbook. And if you look at the implementation here, the first thing that I do is I just go ahead and include the rsyslog server cookbook recipe. So whatever the default one is going to do, I'm going to do that, and I'm basically just adding additional functionality onto it. My second recipe is Socrata rsyslog, and I have a convention of underscore server underscore UDP. That underscore prefix is basically just an indication that if you include that directly in your run list, don't expect good things to happen. It's sort of an internal implementation detail of some other cookbook. And then I have a template that actually drops something into cron to gzip all of the log files. I'm not going to actually show you the template for that, but it's a one-liner in cron that just runs fine. For the UDP, if you actually look at the underlying recipe, I'm just throwing another template in. And fortunately for me, rsyslog has a conf.d configuration syntax. So all I needed to do was actually just add another file in here. And it effectively has the content of just listen on UDP. And I'll set my attribute to TCP. And ta-da, rsyslog is now listening on both services. Again, this is not necessarily the best way of doing it. In theory, if I could push a contribution back up to the rsyslog community cookbook, that's probably a better way of doing it. But for the purposes of an example, it works pretty well. All right. The third technique is monkey patching. This is where things get a little bit more complicated, but you need to use monkey patching if you need to undo some of the actions that were already happening on an existing cookbook that you don't want to happen. For the purposes of this example, we're going to make some tea. So I do not yet have Chef running on any of my teapots, but we're going to simulate it with the purposes of a Ruby block. So I have a Ruby block. It makes tea, and inside of that, I just have some Ruby code that executes a log statement saying we're going to brew some particular type of tea that I can attribute out. Tea takes me 5 seconds to make in this case, and I'm going to go ahead and create it. So if we look at the actual run for this, it's pretty simple. We call the action create on that Ruby block. We brew some green tea because that's my default attribute. It says that it ran in a little over 5 seconds, which is pretty much what you would expect. But we're engineers, and we can do better, and Captain Picard requests that of us. We have the technology, we can improve this. So the easiest way to understand how this monkey patching actually works is to understand the anatomy of a chef run. There's actually some great documentation on the ops code site. I linked to it at the bottom here. But I have a subset of a full chef run that's drawn out here. When you're actually running chef, one of the first things that happens in the actual runtime is that you reset all the node attributes to their default state, and then you do something called compiling the resource collection. This is actually where it's going to run over all of the cookbooks that you actually have in your run list. And then as a separate step afterwards, which a lot of beginners to chef don't actually understand, you converge the node. So the actual execution of the chef recipes is not actually doing anything to the node. It is simply building up a state in memory of what needs to happen, and chef's job is to make it so. So the two parts that we care about in this case are compiling the resource collection and converging the node. My slides are a little off here. All right, so let's go back and look at the simple make tea example. We have a Ruby block that makes tea, and then a block within it that logs to it and does the create. What we need to figure out is what part of this is actually running during the resource compilation phase and what's happening during the convergence phase. And I filled it in for you so that you have a nice little quick reference. The important thing to note here is the yellow is the actual convergence step, and that's where that kernel.sleep5 is actually going to be running. So the action of running this cookbook doesn't take 5 seconds. It's only when you converge that it does. So given that information, we have our two goals here. We want to actually reduce the brew time to 0. We have a Star Trek replicator available to us. And we actually want to also add some notifications that the tea is ready. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually monkey patch this cookbook. So there's 2 steps that I need to do for this. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a really quick and dirty lightweight resource provider for a captain. So my captain resource basically just has an action of tea is ready, and the default provider for it, I'm just going to log and say that make it so. So that way I can go ahead and tell Captain Picard that our tea is ready. Now I also have a cookbook Picard tea. And this is where the monkey patching actually happens. So if you look at the recipe here, the first thing that I'm going to do, just like you do with a wrapper cookbook, is I'm going to include the default recipe, and that's going to execute it. But remember, that part is going to run almost instantaneously and not take the 5 seconds. Next up, I go ahead and I define a Captain Picard so that I can actually notify it. And now I'm going to use the existing resource collection that is currently being built up to load the existing resource of the Ruby block make tea. That object already has the block in it that is going to log some information and sleep for 5 seconds. Now I can go ahead and then replace it by simply calling .block on the existing resource and passing it a new block. And that will make it so that I can now actually add my own attribute for the brew time. And in my Picard tea implementation, I would include a default value of 0 for that. The second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a resource notification on that so that Captain Picard will know when the tea is ready. So if we go ahead and actually run this recipe, what you'll see is pretty much the same thing happening, but now it's going to go a lot faster. The make tea action create still runs. In my attributes, I went ahead and I overrode it so that it's Earl Grey tea. And then I also have the Captain Picard resource notification that happens, and you can see the make it so. And my chef run now runs in milliseconds rather than seconds. This is great. However, that code, if you remember, was kind of ugly. It didn't really look that great. You're stuck with a very non-chef-like DSL for editing those recipes within your own cookbook. Fortunately, there's actually a gem available that makes things a little bit prettier. It is entirely optional. My goal here is to have you actually understand the underpinnings of why it works this way, but it's really just a wrapper around it, and that's Chef Rewind. So in order to use Chef Rewind, it is not a cookbook that you include. It's actually a gem that you have to build into your environment. But if you include that Chef gem and install it and then require it, you now have basically a new block that you can use called Rewind. And in that, you basically just pass it the matching spec to an existing resource. And then just like you would in any existing resource, you can just override any of the attributes in it. So I'm back to just sort of doing block do rather than having to assign it to an existing resource variable and then call it. Notifies works the same way. If you run this, it's a little bit more verbose because the rewind gem actually adds a couple of log lines to it, but you can see that once again it runs in milliseconds rather than seconds and accomplishes the same thing. Now that said, using rewinding and monkey patching does have some pretty significant caveats to it that's not going to work in all of the cases. So first off, one thing that people often get bit by is that they want to replace a template with something on their own, and they will actually just change it and give it a new name. It turns out that when you do that, it's still actually going to default to the cookbook that it was originally defined in rather than in your wrapper cookbook that you are using to monkey patch it. So you have to remember to actually include the cookbook name. The second one, and this is actually a little bit uglier, is that notifications are effectively append only. So if an existing resource already has notifications and you want to get rid of them, it's a lot harder to do that than it is to do most other monkey patching. I believe that you can go ahead and completely remove the resource and redefine it. But that leads me to my third point, which is that you're very likely to duplicate code if you do this. It's just beyond truth that there's not much that you can do about it. If you saw in my example, I basically had to re-include anything like that. Now, those are the three techniques that are basically assuming that you're not going to contribute back to the community. I don't want you to walk away and assume that that's necessarily the best way of doing things. So I want to tell a little story about how Socrata went ahead and contributed back, specifically with the Java Cookbook. The Java Cookbook is one of the more popular ones within the Community Cookbook site. I forgot to pull the exact numbers on it, but I believe that it is, one of the most downloaded cookbooks out there. It also has probably some of the biggest cross-platform support. Socrata's use of it is pretty extensive. Our whole backend platform is built on it, or built on Java. And one of the things that we were running up against all the time was that it being the government, we're subject to a lot of security scans. And those security scans were noting that we were often running an out-of-date version of Java. And we could override that with a wrapper cookbook and whatnot, but it was kind of this constant battle of fighting with the existing upstream. And we thought, hey, wouldn't it be really nice if we could just take over maintainership of it? And whenever Oracle releases a new Java release, we could basically push that update really quickly rather than waiting for the existing maintainers who, frankly, were just a little overburdened with a whole lot of other work so that we could handle that. So we were at the Community Summit at the end of last year, and OpsCode had sort of made the formal decision at that point to start handing off a lot of the OpsCode maintained community cookbooks and giving them off to the greater community. It was a free-for-all session of, whoever wants to adopt it, go ahead, first come, first serve, express some interest. So if you look at the timeline for this, all the way back in October of last year, we had submitted a pull request to update Java to version 75, U45, build 18. And it basically sat there as a pull request through the Community Summit in December. And shortly after the Community Summit, we were added as maintainers to the Git repo. And we actually merged our own pull request in some sense to make this happen. We went ahead and released a version right away, but we weren't done with that. We didn't want to actually, just sort of meet our own needs. We wanted to actually go through and deal with the whole backlog of pull requests that the greater community had. I think at the time there were, probably around 15 or 20 waiting pull requests that just hadn't been reviewed and merged and tested and whatnot. So we spent some time in December to process through that. Shipped a whole bunch of different versions, and we've continued to build on top of that. We've done a lot of work to make the Java cookbook, which frankly was one of the older cookbooks and a little long on the tooth, and we're trying to make it better. So I ran a little diff here of all of the changes from the time that we took it over to now, and you can see that there's actually been a heck of a lot of changes. And one of the things that I'm actually the proudest of is that I love red code a lot more than I love green code. So if you've actually got less to maintain, that's a great thing. So we actually got rid of a lot of redundant code, added a whole bunch of tests, and the Java cookbook has really kind of come a long way in that. If you look at the GitHub graph for it, you can actually sort of see, there were definitely a couple of spikes in 2013, but really end of 2013, early 2014, there's been just a lot more focus on what's going on there. So in that time, this is about a week old, I'm not sure if we've done anything. We've had 41 pull requests merged in, 14 new releases, and we've added 7 new independent, smaller recipes to the cookbook itself. We've also introduced a new cookbook, Java Libraries, that is intended to basically split off some of the lesser used functionality into a second cookbook so that we're not necessarily bloating it as much. So it's all dandelions and butterflies, right? There are pitfalls. If you choose to adopt a community cookbook, you're going to run into a number of things that you need to deal with. First off, Ubuntu. Everyone loves that, and it seems like every cookbook supports it. But actually, funny story, when I was getting started with Chef in 2009, I was also getting started with just building out our infrastructure. So I had the convenience of being able to pick my operating system. And I won't say it was the only reason, but a very significant contributing factor to why Socrata runs on Ubuntu is because at the time, all of the community cookbooks that were available were only authored for Ubuntu. But that's obviously not really the case anymore. Obviously, Red Hat and CentOS are big players in this community, as is Debian. And if you actually look at some of the more popular ones, there's a whole boatload of operating systems out there that you need to support now. Most of them are Linux-based, but I'll note that even now we've got Windows support. There's OpenIndiana, FreeBSD, SmartOS. There's just a lot of features there. Also, everyone has a pet feature. When you take over maintainership, you'll often find pull requests for adding something to it, and sometimes it's just not necessarily appropriate. Like I said, that 10% that customizes it to your own organization, you do have to actually push back a little bit and make sure that what you're building is something clean that the community can use. As I gave an example earlier, we use a Java Libraries cookbook, and the first addition to that was a Java certificate store lightweight resource provider. This is something that is certainly relevant to Java, but it's not necessarily something that everyone is going to care about. So pulling that out into its own cookbook that has its own set of dependencies is a great thing. So draw a line, there can be too much with it. That does bring me to dependencies. Everyone's aware that in your cookbook metadata, you can add dependencies so that it'll pull in other cookbooks. When you're doing a community cookbook, you, in some sense, are now implicitly dependent on other cookbooks. So make sure that you version everything properly. And also, when relevant, you should use recommends or suggests. I went and looked at the documentation for recommends and suggests. And the basic idea behind both of them is that it's documentation that you don't necessarily need this other cookbook in order to use whatever recipes are in your cookbook, but it might light up and be better together if you have it. However, the documentation says that a recommends is strongly suggested and a suggest is weakly suggested. Implementation-wise, I didn't find any actual difference between them. So I went digging. I really didn't find anything significant here, but the Elasticsearch cookbook has a couple of recommends. If you look at it, I don't actually understand why they recommend things like Java, given that Elasticsearch very much depends on having a JRE available. But for example, in Interface Cookbook, not everyone uses ucarp. That sort of makes sense to me. There's a couple other that you suggest. The Build Essential Cookbook suggests pkgutil with a note that you only care about this if you're running Solaris 2. That totally makes sense. The Gems Cookbook only suggests Ruby. Not really sure how that works. So in any event, I was off on a hunt to try and figure out what the difference is. And I did a little data mining. I went and downloaded all 1,300 community cookbooks in the past week, and I went to actually find how many depends, how many recommends, and how many suggests there were. Clearly, everyone uses dependencies. No one really uses recommends and suggests, and they're almost in a dead heat tie. So my recommendation here is pick one and be consistent, and I would actually push Chef themselves to potentially just deprecate one of them because I don't see the purpose between them. I also built a couple cloud tags on folks that are actually using recommends and folks that are using suggests. The size of the word there is basically dependent on how many they're actually using. All right, other things that you will find that you need to do with the community cookbook. You will probably need to build lightweight resource providers. A common theme that I have seen in early cookbooks that needed a lot of extension is that they make the assumption that you will only ever have one of something on a given server. A great example of this is HA proxy. I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with it, but it's a great little lightweight load balancing tool. The community cookbook for HA proxy until version 1.5 basically made the assumption that you were going to be load balancing exactly one thing. So you would define your backends, and you would have a singular front end for it, and it would proxy things through. We needed a lot more than that, and fortunately, the community cookbook has actually come a long ways on that, and they defined a load balancer lightweight resource provider. So if you look at the lightweight resource provider for it, basically, it's all fairly specific to the actual implementation here, but you set all of the attributes that you would need on a given backend or front end, or listen, which is basically a combined version of the two that's a little simpler in the configuration. But the magic happens in the provider here. HA proxy in particular does not have a conf.d directory style configuration. So you literally can only write one configuration out. So what they did in the cookbook here is that they actually build up a set of attributes on the node as part of it. And that means that as you're defining additional lightweight resource providers, you're basically just building up additional attributes on your node. And when you finally actually get to the point where you're going to run your template resource and write out your HA proxy config, you can just iterate over all of those and spit out the configuration. And it works great. All right. One of the other things that you will have to deal with if you choose to accept your mission of adopting a community cookbook is packaging and distribution. There's a whole lot that I've found kind of just wrong with the community cookbooks here. Internet access on a node is not a given. When you're just getting started, that is something that is often easy. But as you move into larger organizations and projects, that's not really an acceptable way of doing it. So the common workaround for this is that you should actually provide alternate URLs for downloads as attributes in your cookbook. And that way you can just have people override it for their own individual environments, typically with a wrapper cookbook. Similarly, you shouldn't assume that every operating system in the world is going to have the software that you need packaged in the version that you need. So you'll often find that you need to actually attribute out package names, because you'll find that some companies will build their own, and instead of being called Nginx, it'll be called Nginx full or something like that, and they're going to want to override that. Also, not all servers have their own build tools. So the common idiom that the community has moved towards here, which I think is actually just fine, is write a separate cookbook for each different technique for installing. So if you want to install from source, you can go ahead and do that. Write a install from source recipe, and then you can actually make it an attribute of the default recipe as to the technique that you want to use. And as you run that, it will basically just include the appropriate recipe. The last technique is making search optional. And I think this one's a little more contentious, but there are those of us who don't necessarily want to be using search for service discovery, or maybe we're just running Chef Solo. I saw Hoorah there in the back. It's really not that hard to actually add a little bit of extra content to your own cookbooks to handle the Chef Solo case. So if you have search and you don't offer a solo option, just go ahead and add it. All you really have to do is make it so that you just make it driven by attributes, and then other people can figure out the right way to do it. Those are the pitfalls. I'd like to thank a couple people here. First off, Joshua Timberman, who I don't actually see in the audience here. For those who don't know Joshua, he was really the guy who seeded the chef community with cookbooks all the way back in 2009 and wrote all the early versions. And while I might berate the code quality on some of the early versions, he really was the pioneer and the trendsetter. Secondly, Chris Armstrong, who was really the impetus behind Socrata adopting the Java cookbook, and you might have seen his avatar on all the GitHub commits. He's really the person who took over that maintainership and really made it the way that it is today. That's all I got. Questions?
I've got a bunch. So I'll start with one, but feel free to come back to me if everyone else is quiet.
All right.
Starting at the end, you talked about adding Chef Solo support.
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of cookbooks also have Chef Spec, which runs as Chef Solo, but you want to stub out a search so you can test that stuff. Do you have any suggestions for that?
So
Does that make sense?
I think so. So the question was, a lot of cookbooks are now using Chef Spec for testing, and that will actually run Chef Solo as part of its run. And is there a good way of supporting that?
You want to test the result. You have searches that you stub out. But if it's running in Chef Solo mode, then the recipe stops all the searches.
Yes.
So you can't stub them anymore because they're not going to run.
Correct. So the question is, when you're running Chef Spec, it runs Chef Solo, which means that you don't have search available to you, and you want to actually stub out the search results and properly test that that is working the way that you expect it to. Am I right there?
I think so.
So I haven't actually handled this problem specifically myself, but my understanding is that there is actually now stub support for fake search results in Chef Solo. I don't know much of the details, but I think that you could probably stub out a search, or just write a mock interface, put it in a library or something like that if you needed to actually make that happen.
So another solution is don't check for if solo at the top. If the node attribute is set, use it. Otherwise, if not in solo, otherwise try and use search, otherwise fail.
So for the video that's only recording my voice, another technique is use the attribute directly. If it doesn't exist, don't check for Chef Solo specifically. Check the attribute. If it exists, use that. If not, use search. If search doesn't work, then go ahead and fail.
If you're using the wrapper cookbook techniques and you need to override a template that is in the original cookbook, what is the best method to use? I've seen people where they're actually changing the resource definition and changing the cookbook name, or is there a better way to do it?
Let me try and actually go back to that slide real quick for you. I don't think I ever showed a template exactly here, but the general, so the question was, if you're using a wrapper cookbook to override a template, what's the best way of doing that? The general trick here is that you're almost undoubtedly going to have your own template. You're going to be writing that, and you're going to be putting that template in your wrapper cookbook. So you'll have your own templates implementation for it. And in this case, you really do have to sort of use the monkey patching technique, because you're going to need to override the existing resource and change it. So as I noted before, you need to actually change the cookbook name of the template resource, and that will make it pull from the other one. And if that's all that you need to do, you can actually keep the template name the same, use the same templates default food.erb, and then as you change the cookbook name, it will instead pull it from your site cookbook rather than from the existing one. Any other questions? I can go back to you.
Yeah, more. Part of it you just answered. You had talked about replacing a block with monkey patching. But I was curious about modifying a resource rather than just flat out replacing it. You always replace them? You sometimes modify them?
So the example that I gave there was actually modifying. It was not flat out replacing it. In the case that I gave, I was actually replacing or modifying every bit of it. But if I go back to that slide, what you'll see I did here, right, is that I took the existing resource and then I changed the block and then I added a notification. If there were other attributes, let's say that instead of being a Ruby block, this were a template, and I was setting the owner or the file mode of the file, if I didn't change it, it would still be the existing values. Cool. Any other questions? Otherwise, thank you for coming. Oh.
So you're talking about the templates, to override the templates, right? Using the monkey patching, or we can do the wrapper, right? Is there a better way to override the metadata? The reason why I'm asking, because most of the cookbooks does the depends, right? It has bitten me, right? Like it was way too back in 2010. We were using this one legacy cookbook from Central Repo, right? And it was highly dependent on one operating system, and we wanted to migrate to another one, and it wouldn't allow us to do.
Yes.
We ended up rewriting the entire thing.
So
but is there a better way to do it?
Yes, so the question is, how do you override the metadata of an existing cookbook so that you don't get bitten by any dependencies that it pulls in? That's actually a fantastic question. I have been bitten by the same thing myself, and I didn't think about that when I was putting together this talk. I don't really have a great solution for you. This is one of those cases where just from a design pattern, it really rubs me the wrong way if I see a cookbook that uses the attribute namespace of another cookbook to override things, because then as you follow some dependency chain, you basically find that a dependency that you're not necessarily even using starts overriding some attributes that you were dependent on. And it's really, really hard to follow and handle that. My recommendation is that that's a great case of pushing changes back to the community and trying to fix the problem underlying it. In particular, if it's a dependency that's not a hard dependency, let's start using suggests and recommends more than depends if possible. All right, thank you.